Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It is a joy to be with you today. We've got a lot going on, so let's get right to it. We've been talking about uh, President Biden. I mean, the specter of whether he's going to be on the ticket or not is looming larger and larger by the day, actually by the hour. Um, if he's replaced, who replace him? How would that work? Donors, because they have sounded the alarm. Now everything is thrown into chaos. It's not about what you voted on in the spring. It's about what the voter. It's about what the donor class wants right now. But excuse me, it's also about someone's health and and what this means. Who's really running the White House? Who makes the decisions? Well, let's talk about that here on the Santita Jackson Show, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Go to am950radio.com so that you can stream. But we are also on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. The Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Meet us over there at Santita Jackson and Friends on Facebook. Meet us there. I am so happy to be with you today because we've got a very special guest. I'm always so excited when we have this man here with us because whenever anything happens in the world, I want to speak with this gentleman because he knows so much and he's always so willing to share. We're so blessed to have someone who has really been in the inner sanctum of power, who's willing to share with us what really happens there. And of course, I am speaking about none other than Ray McGovern, co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Of course, he's the former CIA intelligence officer who in the 1980s chaired this, everybody, the National Intelligence Estimates Group. And what do? They prepare the president's daily briefing. And so I want to know from him just what we're looking at. We've had presidents who have dealt with infirmities before. Of course, Woodrow Wilson had a stroke, and his wife famously or infamously, depending upon how you look at it, she was running the White House. We find out years later that even though John Kennedy gave you he was the picture of health, the fact that he was struggling with his health. And in fact, many in his own family had not expected him to live to old age because of Addison's disease and because of an injury he sustained in the Second World War, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many people do not know that it was hard for him to walk every day. He had a special chair that he sat in. And most of the time, he was almost on a walker. Yeah, in his 40s, but he struggled. And then FDR, addled by polio, came back from that, but he could not walk. And of course, we handled people with physical infirmities very differently 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago, and then before. But he knew enough about the needs of the public, particularly the needs of the public who were starving, who were in a depression, an emotional depression, and an economic depression. He never came before the public, at least and I would say throughout most of his presidency. He didn't let us see him in the wheelchair. No. And when he had to speak at the inauguration, his sons held him up because we needed that. But what's going on here? What's going on here, and how does the president's cognitive state, how is it impacting his work? The noted journalist Seymour Hersh has been reporting that the president's staff have been concerned that he's not able to connect the dots. And so it's affecting his decision-making capabilities. Yeah, that's a real thing. So let's talk about this, everybody, with Ray McGovern. Welcome back to the show as calls for President Biden to step down continue to grow. How are you, Ray McGovern?
I'm great, Santita. Thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, no, it's always a joy to be with you. Let me just ask you, let me step back. when you did you see the debate? Certainly, you heard about the debate.
No,
What did
no, I
you?
watched it. That's part of my job. I have to not only watch debates like that, but I have to read memoirs and I have to do all kinds of things so I know what various people are saying and thinking and writing or pretending to think.
So when you saw the debate, what did you think? Just,
Oh, I had the same impression I think any decent person would have. Elder abuse.
mm,
I mean, quite simply, my first thought was that I wonder, if this is some sort of conspiracy. They must have known that he was going to do so poorly. Was this some sort of way to get him uh, to step down? Is it? Do they want to make it so clear that he's not quite ready to do one more year, much less 4 more years? But then I got to thinking, well, no, Biden is a very stubborn person, and he's not clearly in control of all of his faculties. He's come back from defeat and the jaws of defeat before, and so I think it's mostly he and his family and Hunter. I mean, look who has deep stakes in whether that fellow with the orange hair, whether he comes in. I mean, my God, if he comes in, not only Hunter, but Daddy and Blinken and Sullivan, they're all demonstrably guilty of crimes, whether they have to with foreign affairs or with finagling, interfering with the last election in 2020. These things are all going to come home to roost. So what I'm saying, Santita, is that there's a personal stake in all this, lest these people lose and then lose their freedom by being shunted off to some jail. Now that's not hyperbole. that's what they fear, and my fear is that to prevent that, they're going to do everything they possibly can not to lose. Where? In Ukraine. And the only thing left to them to stem the inexorable Russian advance there would be to resort to, their ace in the hole nuclear weapons. And I say that with great trepidation. I hate to hear myself saying that, but I would not put it past these fellows in extremis to threaten and perhaps even use some sort of low yield, they call it, mini nuke, to stop Russia, teach them a lesson, and show
what
the rest of the
is
world how
what
strong we are.
what is a low yield nuclear weapon? That sounds so? It just sounds crazy. How?
Yeah, it's about
Just
as
help me with that.
about as nice as you can make it sound. Low yield. Well, we know that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the equivalent of 15 kilotons. Well, they've got the nuclear warheads dialed back to the point where they can just do maybe 2 kilotons or maybe just 1 kiloton. It's crazy. It's exactly right. It's crazy. Now, it really doesn't matter what I think about all this, although I've been trying to put myself in the shoes of the leaders of the Kremlin for, well, 5 decades now. Okay, that used to be my job at the CIA. It's still my job as I see it, paying back, so to speak, giving back. But, it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what Vladimir Putin, the head of the Russia, thinks, and his counselors, his admirals, and his generals. And they have to be on tenterhooks. They are facing the worst possible situation. Putin has said this. The thing they look at in a president across the ocean is predictability. That's what they hope for because he's got his fingers on the nuclear butler. Somebody has his fingers. Somebody knows those special codes. So they have to be armed to the teeth and ready to retaliate at any given moment. That's what scares the hell out of me. I've been around here for a long time, and I've never seen it so tentative, so dangerous. and so explosive in both the literal and the metaphorical sense of that word, explosive.
We're talking with Ray McGovern, veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity. Indeed, uh, he briefed the president, prepared the presidential daily brief for decades. And we're talking about the question about whether President Biden is up to the job, right? Um, of course, depending upon where he is, that would determine that. We now have press reports, credible press reports, that show that at least 9 times the White House has been visited since 2023 by one of the top Parkinson's specialists in the country, indeed in the space. Um, so there's something going on. We saw that on uh, well, almost 2 weeks ago at the debate. And I have to say, um, Ray McGovern, what was amazing was reading the Daily Mail just a few days later, not even a few days later, maybe a day or two later. They called it a soft coup, Ray McGovern, because they said indeed, um, his staff, key members of his staff put him out there because they didn't know any other way to let the public know where the state of the president's health and the state of his decision making capabilities. That does sound probable to you?
Well, Santita, that was my first thought, actually. And it was so gross. And they were with him for a whole week practicing
Mhm.
in Camp David. They must have known that there was a good chance that he'd act as poorly as he did. But, thinking about Biden and what he's been saying and thinking and how his family has been really running things, it struck me that it's equally possible, probably more probable, that Biden is really feels he's still president and he can make these decisions and he can survive this and he knows better than anyone else. What's concerning, Santita, is something you mentioned in the introduction. You talked about who's running things. I mean, who's running the country, and by extension, who's running the world? No, you mentioned the debate. Well, even more gross, in my view, was his interview with George Stephanopoulos. At one point, he says, he didn't say like George W. Bush, this is hard work. It's hard work. No, he said it a different way. He said, this is really a challenge. I mean, I'm not only running a political campaign for reelection, but I'm running the world at the same time. And that's not hyperbole, says the president. No, no. What's her name? The
Kamala? Well,
no,
he's a
no, I'm
black woman.
talking about no, the Secretary of State under Albright. Yeah, he says, Albright was right. We are the indispensable country in the world, and running the world as well as an election campaign. My God, it was just short of amazing. So what am I saying? I think he thinks he's running the world. He's got illusions of grandeur. He's illusionary, and as I say, that's really dangerous because if he's susceptible to suggestions by his advisors to include going on stage and making something of himself that nobody wanted to see, then suppose they say, "Well, Mr. President, we're really in trouble here. Son Hunter is going to go to jail for 30 years if that orange orange guy comes in, and so we need to do X, Y, and Z." And then he said, "Okay, you know how to do that? Well, you gave us the codes before. Let's check to see if we still have them." I'm like, hello? It's never been this bad. Even you mentioned that previous presidents have been disabled. Remember when Ronald Reagan was shot, right?
Yeah.
I was on active duty at that time, and it was a really tumultuous time. And what happened? Did George H.W. Bush, his vice president, come forward and say, "Look, calm down, everything's fine, I'm in charge now"? No. Who did say that? Alexander Haig.
That's a
he was
terrible secretary.
The national. Well, actually, he was national security advisor at that time, and he
You're
was
right.
secretary. Yeah. So he
When
said,
he
"I'm in
ran
charge."
to the podium and said, "I'm in charge here," I was like,
Yeah.
"What?" I was in high school. I'm wondering what is going on here because it's
Yeah.
like he was almost out of breath. Ray McGovern, he's running.
Yeah.
I'm in charge. I said, what was good? Because they hadn't they just signed some order of that affected um, the succession just before Reagan was shot. Something along
I'm
those
sorry.
lines.
What was your question?
Had they just signed some new, or had they just reestablished how the White House how the White House would be handled in case the
Well,
president was incapacitated just before
yeah,
he was
I think
shot?
that was before he went and had a colonoscopy. I
Yeah.
think that that was when they worked out an arrangement so that wouldn't happen. But that was what I'm saying here is there's an example of who thinks they're running the country and the world. In that case, national security. But later, under Reagan, he became, for a brief time, as you said, Secretary of State. And so who are these guys that are running the country now and running the world? If they're deputized, so to speak, by the president, go run the world now. Now, one of the things I like to emphasize, Santita, in this whole mess is the performance of the media.
Mm.
Now, I mean, my God, I thought it couldn't get worse. But how many times have you heard from leading spokespeople and pundits and interviewers and so forth? The president he's sharp as a tack. That was one meme that
Yeah.
sharp as a tack. You have to see him one on one. He just, so sharp as a tack. No, that one interview or one debate with Trump showed that to be 180 degrees away from reality. And what did they do? They professed surprise. Oh my God, look at this! My God, we didn't know any of this. Of course they knew. They were following instructions. Okay, and that's the real mischievous part of this because uh, when when the president says, as he did during the debate, look, Vladimir Putin is a war criminal and he wants all of Ukraine. Do you think he'll stop? What do you think happens to Poland and other places? End quote. That is as big a lie as that he's fully compos mentis, or earlier on, 20 years ago, the lie that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Okay. Now, there's a big difference, Santita, between our efforts way back 22 years ago, 23 years ago, to prove that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to include Scott Ritter, who was the head of the inspection team, the UN inspection team, that proved that had testimony and had inspection showing that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, because people could call us, oh, you're sympathetic to Saddam Hussein, and besides, look, everybody says, and besides, Condoleezza Rice says that the first sign we'll have of this might be a mushroom cloud. Now, how afraid should you be? And besides, did you know that Saddam Hussein has ties with Al Qaeda? Sotto voce. So Saddam Hussein was at least in part responsible for 9/11. My God, how can you defend this? How can you say anything other than what we all, the mass media, say? Well, in those days, we had no real platform, no real comeback to that. We intelligence people knew that our colleagues, our former colleagues, had information from the Iraqi foreign minister and from the Iraqi intelligence chief that there were no weapons of mass destruction, but we couldn't get to first base. Now, what's my point here? Well, my point here is that now we don't have to prove by our own logic and by our own analysis that Biden is actually 180 degrees away from the truth when he says Putin will not stop at Ukraine. He'll go on to Poland, the Baltic states, and Hungary, and before you know it, he'll be on the English Channel. Okay, we can prove that that's wrong. And how do we prove that that's wrong? Well, hold on to your hats, folks. You may not know this because of the dereliction of duty on the part of the media, but guess what? 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, in March, April 2022, just 6 weeks after Russian troops went into Ukraine, hold on to it now, Putin stopped. Okay? 4 days after the invasion, the Russians made it very clear they wanted to talk about this. They wanted to see if there was some way they could do this peacefully. And Zelensky appointed his best friend, a guy named David Arachamia, to be the head of a delegation meeting with the Russians in Belarus early, like 4 days after the invasion, and then in Turkey. They worked out a deal. Now, again, I don't have to say all this. I don't have to analyze it. This is what David Arachamia said. Well, he told the Kiev Post this a year ago. I just want to quote a couple of sentences. The Kiev Post, November 26, 2023, title, Russia offered to end the war in 2022 if the Ukraine scrapped its ambitions to join NATO. Okay. Here's Arachamia quoted in this major Kiev newspaper. Quote, neutrality was the biggest thing for them. They were ready to end the war if we took, as Finland once did, neutrality and made commitments that we would not join NATO. While negotiations continued in Istanbul, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson unexpectedly arrived in Kiev on April 9th, 2022, and said that Ukraine shouldn't sign anything with them at all and, quote, let's just fight, end quote. Wow. So that was the end of the deal. The deal was neutrality, that is, not joining NATO on the part of Ukraine, a ceasefire, no more bloodiness, undertakings by the Russians to say, okay, look, you're afraid of us. We'll work out security arrangements where you don't have to be afraid of us, okay? And we'll put off thorny issues like Crimea and other things until later. So that was the deal. It was initialed. Okay? And the U.S. and UK sent Boris Johnson and say, no, don't deal with them. Don't sign that. We'll give you everything you need to stem the Russian advance. They couldn't do it. And look at the map, for God's sake. Just a parenthetical remark. Obama warned in 2015, look, the worst thing we could do for the Ukrainians would be for us to give them the idea that they could prevail militarily against a much stronger Russia. So let's not give them any weapons, okay? Don't give them any idea they could prevail because they can't, okay? I don't know where Biden was when Obama made that sensible decision, but that's what happened. Now we say we're gonna support you as long as we can, and unfortunately, we don't have the weapons, or the weapons may arrive like Christmas, but that's kind of late. And besides that, looks like the Russians are going to conquer pretty much the part of Ukraine that they wish to keep before the election. So what I'm saying here is Biden and his colleagues are in what we used to say, they're in trouble deep, we say in the comic books, right? They are in trouble deep. And now they have to figure out a way out of here, and it's not going to be easy. Meanwhile, the last thing I'll say is that Putin has put down his cards. He said, these are the terms now. We're willing to talk. Did you hear that? We're still willing to talk. And there is some flexibility in the terms that he laid down. So the refusal to talk, to even engage the other side, is a first in my experience, and I've been around for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Look, I want to know, what is it like to go in and brief the president? And what would your responsibility be if you saw the president obviously struggling cognitively?
Well,
Would that,
it would,
well, let me just ask you first, would that concern you?
of course, yeah. I,
Well,
you know,
no,
I
no, no,
was,
wait. I have to ask you that question. It might seem obvious because he's been getting briefed for 3 years and everybody 3.5 years. And when you bring this up, there's something wrong with you. I'm,
well, Santita, it's a really good question. And the reality is that intelligence is supposed to be non-biased, apolitical, supposed to tell the president the truth. Like, you remember old uh, Jack Friday, was it? Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Well, in my day, we were able to do that. I saw these people one on one early in the morning. Now, I have to tell you that Ronald Reagan chose most mornings to sleep in. Okay.
okay.
So the persons that I saw were the Vice President Bush, Secretary of State um, Schultz, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, and a whole slew of assistants for national security affairs, some of whom ended up in jail later. I also saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now that was one on one, and you asked what was that like? Well, it was a kind of a personal integrity thing. You knew what the line from the agency was with respect to this new Soviet leader. His name was Gorbachev.
Mhm.
Uh, Most people don't know how to pronounce that still, but I have to, a little aside here. Um, Vice President George H.W. Bush says to me at one morning, he says, Ray, how do you pronounce this? You know Russian. How do you say this? So I said,
Sound like him.
repeat, repeat after me. I said, and garbage, garbage. Now, off, off. Now, accent the off and say them together. Gorbachev. Got it, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President. That's it. And then, I could go into the semantics or the orthology of this, why it had to
Oh,
be off and all that, yeah, but I didn't think he was really interested in that. So we left it. So that was the kind of thing that he knowing my background and the fact that he spent decades before, even then, watching Russia, teaching Russian and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm saying here is that they had a certain trust in me, the more so because they knew that I thought Gorbachev was the real deal, that you could deal with him. Okay.
mm,
Now, my bosses, a fellow named William Casey, who was the
mm.
director, and a fellow named Bobby Gates, who was the head of analysis, and who, by the way, worked for me in the
Oh,
70s. Now he's my boss. They were telling the president every turn, Gorbachev is just a phony. He's a commie, for God. He's just a cleverer commie than all the rest of them. Don't deal with him. Now, at this one morning, I'm in there with Secretary George Shultz, who's really the smartest guy around. Okay. So he says to me, I've just been invited to visit Gorbachev in the Kremlin. I suppose your superiors would say that's a terrible idea. So I said, Mr. Secretary, you're probably right. That's what my superiors would say. And he looks at me and he smiled. He says, what do you think? I said, it's a terrific idea. Go, for God's sake. He's ready to deal. Now, that was 1984, right?
mm.
2 years later, uh, Reagan, having listened not only to me, but to George H.W. Bush, his vice president, who felt like George Bush, you could deal with these people, and having spurned the efforts of Gates and Casey and Weinberger to scuttle any improvement in relations with Russia, he finally developed a relationship with Gorbachev, where there was mutual trust, for God's sake, and the conditions which permitted Gorbachev in 1986 to say, hey, Mr. President, we have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We've got sea-launched ballistic missiles. We've got nuclear bombs on bombers. Why do we need missiles in Europe so that the reaction time has to be 10 minutes rather than 30 minutes? And Reagan says, I'll look into that. He comes back and says, that's a good question. What do you propose? Gorbachev says, let's destroy that entire class of missiles. And Reagan says, yeah, but they're already there, for God's sake. The warheads, let's destroy them, okay? They have no purpose. They just make it more dangerous, okay? And so Reagan says, well, let's see if that can be done. Now, I was very active in those days. I was there. I said to myself, McGovern, this is the first in history. This will never happen. Destroy all these missiles. They range from 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers, short range and medium range ballistic missiles. There were SS-20s in Russia. There were Pershing 2s in Western Europe. So what happened? They agreed, and they signed an agreement in December 1987 that they would destroy them all. And for those naysayers, they appointed inspection people like Scott Ritter, my good friend, to go up into godforsaken places like Votkinsk and other places in Siberia to be there in person to monitor the destruction of these weapons. Of course, the Soviets came to the United States to do the same thing. And what happened? What happened was an entire class of medium-range and short-range ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads was destroyed. That's how it came. That's how a measure of trust can happen. Okay. Now, what do I mention all that? Well, I mention it for two reasons. People have to put into perspective how things have declined in the way of trust and in the way of U.S. Soviet and U.S. Russian relations. Back in 1972, when Bobby Gates was working in my branch, I had three people with the SALT delegation, SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, okay? They took place in Vienna. They took place in Helsinki. We were asked by Nixon and Kissinger, do you think the Russians are serious? And we said, I was the branch chief. We said, yes, they're serious. Well, how do you know that? Kissinger says, two reasons. They don't want to be spent into oblivion. And number two, they see themselves in a real contest with or developing good relations with you. And what happened, of course, was that they met and they worked out a deal, and it was called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Now, I'll explain what it is very short. Both sides were building anti-ballistic missiles to shoot down the ballistic missiles. And most people realize that you can't really do this. There's always a chance that decoys and everything will screw the anti-ballistic missiles. Okay, so they came to an agreement. No more than 2 anti-ballistic missile sites in any country, Russia or the United States. And then later, 1 year later, 1 site. So that way, no country could think that they'd make a first strike and escape immediate devastating retaliation. I was there in Moscow, May 1972. That thing was signed. And for 3 decades, until George W. Bush came into office, namely 2001 and then 2002, he said, we're getting out of that, okay? So 3 decades of stability washed away by Bolton and others who told George W. Bush, get out of that treaty. Now, what about the Intermediate Forces Nuclear Treaty, the INF, they call it? That's the small range and the intermediate range ballistic, which they destroyed. Well, as I said, that was 1987. Trump got out of that in 2019. Why? Well, because our military wanted to build those missiles again, and he couldn't face them down. So do the math. 1987 to 2019. Oh, that's
32.
32 years, okay? And the Russians say, "Why are you doing this?" And we said, "None of your damn business." So that's the background now. And what Putin has just said is, look, when you guys left the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the one that went for 32 years, we said that we would have a moratorium. We wouldn't produce and deploy such weapons again, as had been the case before 1987, unless we saw you doing it. Now we see you doing it. And we have production, we have orders for these missiles. And as soon as you do it on a grander scale, we're going to do the same thing. So, okay. So now we're back to the very delicate, very dangerous situation where we had missiles that we really didn't need and reduced the warning time. The warning time for some of these missiles is about 9 minutes. And if they're hypersonic missiles, the US doesn't have them yet, but the Russians do. The warning time is about 5 minutes from someplace in Ukraine, let's say, or Poland or Romania, 5 minutes to Moscow or to ICBM sites. So what's coming to a head now with the NATO meeting, the NATO summit coming into place starting tomorrow in Washington, is the real denouement here. What are these European leaders? Most of them just used to bowing in obeisance to the U.S. Whatever it says goes. What are they going to do when Biden and his entourage say we're going to do X, Y, and Z now? We'll show the Russians a lesson and blah blah blah. Are they going to say, "Oh, that's fine, sure, we'll do that again," or are they going to stand up? There's a chance. There's enough dissidents within NATO, Hungary, Slovenia,
But we
even
don't want to deal with Hungary because they have a right wing leader, right?
they have, yeah, it's really kind of weird. They have a right wing leader, but he's speaking more sense of all the others. And as you know, Santita, he's just been in Kiev
Yeah.
and then 2 days later in Moscow saying, "Look, this is idiocy. We need to talk." And here I am. He's in charge of foreign policy for the European Union for 6 months on a rotating basis. He said, I'm gonna exploit my 6 months in position here to see if we can't talk some sense into people who are willing to negotiate. So there's a lot at stake at this meeting, and mostly, of course, it comes back to the fact that Ukraine forswore any intention to join NATO back in March, April of 2022. Then they were prevailed upon. No, fight it to the end. Now the end is near, so to speak. The Russians are advancing on that entire axis. They're doing it gradually, so you hardly notice it. But we notice it. We can see the photos of where they are. So will they come to their senses? There's no indication that the Biden administration will. The question is whether even the French now, or the Hungarians, or other people have expressed doubts about this. To a degree, the Italians, whether they'll say, "Well, look, we've been slavishly following your orders since World War II, and look where we are now. No thanks. Let's go to negotiations." Putin has put his cards on the table. There's flexibility there. Let's talk at least, for God's sake. That's what makes sense.
We're talking with Ray McGovern, veteran intelligence professionals for SANITY. Indeed, the former chair of the intelligence estimates uh, group in the White House. He prepared the daily briefing for the President of the United States. I'm struck as you give this story, which is so fascinating. Excuse me. The importance, it leads me to something my father has talked about often, the importance of personal relationships. When people trust you, they work with you very differently. Um, and I'm struck by what happened at the G7 conference, how alarmed the European leaders were by President Biden. And the media kept saying, corporate media kept saying, well, you didn't see what you saw. I saw him trying to sit down. The chair was not there. I'm, I, I see now the stories come out that his wife is talking to him through an earpiece. I'm not mad about any of it, but I'm concerned because I saw all of the European leaders looking at our president, wondering what in the HE double hockey sticks was going on. I, Ray McGovern, am I? Did I see what I saw, or was I? Thank you.
You're believing your lying eyes.
I did. I did. I'm just asking you that because I want to take people behind the curtain. When I first met you, you would say to me over and over again, Santita, you know this because you've been in the room, and I'm so grateful that our father would take us in the room. Funny story before you answer this question. My brother Jonathan, I've got a second brother in Congress now, and he's on foreign affairs. He was in some meeting, and I can say this is a matter of public record. I would never, he wouldn't reveal anything to me that was classified, to be fair. But I can say this because this is a matter of public record. He said, they were talking about Russia, Ukraine. He said, well, okay, well, is anyone, and he said, Santita, I just brought this up. He said it stopped the meeting. And what did he bring up, Ray McGovern? He said, well, is anyone having a back channel conversation with Putin?
Mm.
And everybody said, oh, what are you talking about? He said, come on, you guys. That's how this is done. But what are you talking about? Of course, no one doesn't talk to anyone. That's crazy. People talk, and that's how you get things resolved. You might not have a meeting for the public, but you have the back channel meetings. But now I'm looking at the European leaders, and they were looking at the president like, what is going on with this man? And now I've got Seymour Hersh who's saying that his staff are saying he's not making the connections, you guys. You looked at this, and as I did, I said, now I know before they moved him out onto that stage, they knew what shape he was in. I don't know what they've been doing for a week. But wait a minute. What's going on here? And the Daily Mail indeed called it a soft coup. They said, look, they wanted to let everybody know where he is. With so much on the line this week with NATO, how does the speculation about his condition, how will that impact these talks?
Well, that's the big thing here. Tita, the business about backdoor channels, that's big.
Okay.
Now,
Should he have not mentioned it? Should he have kept his mouth shut?
No. That's just Jonathan knows more than the rest of those guys there, because if they were unaware that this is how things really get done, well, they're not very accomplished in foreign affairs. Let me give you a little vignette. When we were negotiating the SALT treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty that was so salutary in keeping the strategic balance for 30 years, that was done in backdoor channels. Now, who did it? A fellow named Henry Kissinger, right? Now, he didn't fly around mindlessly like Blinken and, ostentatiously make speeches at every airport and hug Netanyahu and hug Soviet. No. He, you know what? When I was at the embassy in Moscow here, this is true, okay? I walked into the men's room in the political section, and scrawled on the wall behind the commode was, Kissinger was here. No,
Are you kidding me?
No. The point was not that Kissinger was in this particular bathroom. He was in Moscow, okay? He was negotiating with top Soviet leaders. And what was his custom? Not to let anybody, not even the ambassador, know about this, okay? And when he came out from Moscow and landed in Helsinki, he'd get on the phone and say, oh, Ambassador Beam, I just want to let you know I was talking to the Soviet leaders here, and we're making progress on the SALT agreement. That's all you need to know. I was there from Thursday to Saturday, and we're gonna do it. Thank you very much. Boom. Now, Here's another interesting thing. The diplomats were up in arms. How can he do this thing without letting us know he's in town? And so Jacob Beam, who was the ambassador, convened us all of us, into this bubble where nobody can hear it, secure bubble. And he says, we are allowed to know as much as our masters tell us to know. Okay. Now, I'm reminded, says Jacob Bean, I'm reminded of being in Berlin, 1937, 1938. Uh, the goose step was going down all the boulevards. The Nazi flags were all over the place. The threats against Jews and everyone else. And the naval attaché in a meeting like this said, you know, nobody tells us what's going on here, and I wish they would just tell us what's going on. He said, the ambassador then reamed this guy on and said, get out and watch what's going on, and you'll find out what's going on. Now, so Beam says, look, you do your job. Kissinger is doing his job. It's okay because Kissinger is working for the president like we are. And if the president wants Kissinger to do this, backdoor channels, that's what he's going to do. Now, Biden, Blinken, just the opposite. This overt diplomacy, which he lands in Tel Aviv for the first time after the attack on Israel, Hamas, and he says, I just want to remind you, I'm a Jew, and I'm going to help you out here. Now, I mean, he's supposed to be a diplomat. Why would he right off the bat say, look, I'm supposed to do this back channel or front channel stuff, but I'm a Jew, so don't expect me to be very.
Well, no, I mean, what was that about?
I don't know. Maybe he just slipped, but he is a Jew. He's a Zionist, and so is Sullivan. Jewish has nothing to do with it. The Jewish religion is pure and very much against what they're doing now. Zionism, the political movement, something else. And so I guess he got them mixed up. I guess he identified the two of them, which many in Congress do. So all I'm saying here is back channel is really, really a fruitful way. And what Orban, in his visit to Kiev in Ukraine and Moscow in Russia, just over the last week, what he's been trying to do is say, look, nobody else will act as a mediator. I want to get talks started. I go to Ukraine first and I say, hey, how about an immediate ceasefire? And then I get the reaction, and then I go to Moscow and I talk with Putin. Now, in the press conference at the end of his visit to Moscow, one of the more alert correspondents says, now, President Orban, did Zelensky react when you said, how about an immediate ceasefire? And Orban, master diplomat, says, I told that to President Putin. Question, President Putin, what did Zelensky, can you tell us how Zelensky reacted? Putin, no.
Oh, wow.
There's some credit to be given to people who know when to stop talking, for God's sake. Now, Zelensky overtly said, nothing doing. And so did Putin. Nothing doing with an immediate ceasefire. We need a concrete agreement before we get sucked into a ceasefire. But there's leeway, there's flexibility, and you never know that unless you pursue it in back channel communications. And that's what this president is apparently unable to do, given the advisors he has. My God, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what comes out of this NATO meeting, whether it will be more of Ukraine becomes part of NATO eventually, or whether they'll finally say, well, look, that was a good try. What we got out of that was a war with almost 500,000 Ukrainian youth dead after we agreed to stop. Okay, let's stop now. I don't know if there are enough Europeans would have the courage to say that, as Orban has pretty much said, but there's hope now that there's a channel open, and common sense hopefully could prevail.
We're talking with Ray McGovern, who former chair of the Intelligence Estimates Group in the White House. I'm rubbing my temples because You're giving me a lot to think about because there's so much at stake. There's so much more at stake than most of us even know, because certainly the corporate media are not even discussing this.
That's right. They're hiding it.
Yeah, they're hiding it. And I've got about 5 minutes left here. And I want to give that to you because by hiding it, they're not obscuring, they're hiding this. And this is very dangerous. I mean, the use of any kind of nuclear weapons, Ray McGovern, that cloud's going to hit everybody in the world. It's just nobody goes untouched. Help me. I mean, what should our concern be with President Biden right now? Because it's very clear he's struggling. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. My father has Parkinson's, but he's not struggling cognitively in that way. His speech is an effort. And after certain hours, I know, okay, I'm not going to really be able to understand him as much as he is trying. But people are always struck, Ray McGovern, when they see Reverend Jackson, they're always struck by the fact that intellectually he's still there. The fear that we have with President Biden is that that is not true. And apparently that is the concern of his staff, according to some press reports. And now when you've got matters of such great import that are before us, help me. The last 5 minutes are yours.
Oh, thank you, Santita. Let me just sum up by pointing to the meeting that starts tomorrow. A NATO summit, of course, involves the principal leaders from each one of the now 32 countries in NATO.
Mm-hmm.
When I was around, there were 14. Okay. And when I was around, we promised the Russians not to expand NATO to the east of East Germany. This is really important because it was at a NATO summit. The date was April 3rd, 2008, where the U.S. decided, and everyone went along with it. It was Bush on his way out, his last year in office. They decided that Ukraine and Georgia, the country of Georgia, will become members of NATO. That was a direct quote. That was the final declaration. Look it up. April 3rd, I think, 2008. Now, we had already been warned. Our ambassador at that time is now head of the CIA, okay? His name was Bill Burns. And Lavrov, the foreign minister, called Bill Burns into the foreign ministry and said, look, if this happens, we will have to decide whether to intervene in Ukraine. Why? Well, because there's going to be a civil war there, sure as can be. And it's right on our border. Look at the map. So please, niet means niet. Don't even think of letting Ukraine into NATO. Okay, now, to his credit, Burns back then, 2008, says, look, this is a warning. Every knuckle dragger in the bottom of the Kremlin to the highest officials feels really strongly about this, so please don't do it, okay? Well, Bush and Cheney and Condoleezza Rice did it anyway. Now, when finally it came to the point where the Russians felt they had to intervene, that was after NATO offered Ukraine membership. And parenthetically, what did Bill Burns say then? This was unprovoked, completely out of the blue. This major invasion of Ukraine was completely out of the blue, unprovoked. Well, his own cables, his own memoirs show that it was provoked it was really provoked. So what I'm saying now, I'm saying that this meeting here has to come to grips with whether Ukraine is still considered in line for membership in NATO. And what we have now is admissions by the head of NATO, a fellow named Jens Stoltenberg. He's from Norway. He's been the Secretary General of NATO for 8 or 9 years. Now, he said last year, the 7th of September, he said, look, this is what happened in early 2022. The Russians, they said, look, we have to do a deal. We have to do a deal in Europe that doesn't let Ukraine in NATO, Stoltenberg. And so we said no. And Putin said, this is a condition. If you don't prevent Ukraine from going to NATO, we will have to invade. We said no. And he invaded. And guess what? Now there are more people in NATO, Finland and Sweden. What about those 500,000 young Ukrainian kids killed?
Who we
What,
never hear about.
what about the fact that Ukraine can't possibly win that? Obama was right. Don't give them the idea they can win. Look at the map, for God's sake. Interestingly, Blinken during that same year said, oh, yeah, Obama is right. Blinken was Deputy Secretary of State. Then he said, Obama is completely right because anything we give the Ukrainians in terms of weaponry, they can match, they can double, they can triple, they can quadruple. Blinken. Okay, so what happened when Biden came in? Illusions of grandeur. And if he thinks, as he said to George Papadopoulos, that he's running the world, that's an illusion that's really, really strange and very dangerous. And all I can say is, again, it doesn't matter what I think about that. It does matter what the head of China, what the head of Russia, and now they're joined at the hip in opposition to us because of the way we proceed, what they think. And they have to be at full alert, lest the people that are in charge get access to these codes and decide, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Maybe we can just do one of these low-yield nuclear things, show the Russians and the world how tough we are, and not lose the election.
Ray McGovern. Ray McGovern. There is so much at stake, everybody. So much at stake. And so this is not about a horse race. This is about the human race. Please, everybody, let's pray for our country. Let's pray for the president. Let's pray that the right decisions are made, because leaders all over the world are looking at our president and they are not just concerned, but they're scared to death. They are. Think about that. Ray McGovern, everybody. RayMcGovern.com. I follow him because I want to know what's going on in the world. See you tomorrow on the Santita Jackson Show. Ray McGovern. Ray McGovern.